Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is David with Remote Year, and I'd love to welcome you all to the inaugural Knowledge Drop. We'll have some people filter in the next couple of minutes, I'm sure, but I wanted to say hello to everyone for here in Mexico City. It's 7:30 in the morning, and very excited to start up this series. This will be happening every 2 weeks with a new remote, giving a new piece of knowledge, dropping a new piece of knowledge, as it were. And we will definitely let you guys know in your calendars, in your emails, in Slack, all over for future ones. And I'm super, super excited to present today Mr. Paul Perry from Magellan. And so just to run through quickly what the format's going to look like, it's going to be about 15 minutes of presenting. And after that, you guys can go ahead and ask some questions. So to keep the Q&A nice and easy, there's at the very bottom of your screen, the Zoom screen, there should be a little Q&A icon. Feel free to type in questions literally anytime. And at the very end, Paul will go in and be able to pick out some to answer. So feel free, you don't have to hold them till the end. Feel free to type them in. Just make sure to use the Q&A and not the chat. That'll be a little less distracting. So without further ado, I would love to introduce Paul from Magellan.
Cool. Thanks, David. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And hi, everybody. It's cool to lead this off, and it's fun to go first. So, all right, let me jump in here. I'll start off by sharing my screen and just run through the brief presentation put together, and then definitely I'm most interested in questions. So let's start here. Give me 1 second. All right, hope everyone can see my screen, my browser here. All right, so today we're going to talk about mastering your story of self. I'm Paul. I'm affectionately known as PDP as my initials by my Magellan crew. I miss you guys and over there in Lima. I'm in Mexico City hanging out with David and the Ikigai folks right now. So let's just jump in. So what's about to drop? We're going to talk a lot about story of self, and there's a lot of text here, but I'll run through piece by piece. So one thing that's important when thinking about story of self is just being vulnerable in just the right way. So a lot of times we think about, when we're vulnerable in conversation or in public speaking or something that, it scares us. Public speaking is like the #1 thing that people are afraid of, even before death, based on polling in America. So think about how vulnerability actually draws people to you and connects them to you and your cause, and how to use that powerful public vulnerability. Another point is that people care about who. You probably have heard the Simon Sinek talk about, start with why, but I think the who is also important as well. People want to know, who they're buying a product or service from, or who they're collaborating with. You see it in the Delete Uber campaign, so they care about the values of the company just as much as they do about the product that they're delivering. And then lastly, on this side, there's no perfect process, but I want to give you some structure for developing a story of self, whatever works for you. But I think there are a few key pieces that are important. And then just a quick note on credentials. I gave a TEDx talk once, and I think it was well received. My dad was there. He liked it. So, but feel free to take a look at that. And I try to weave in my story of self into the work that I was doing at that time in 2014. And then also, I took a public narrative course in, I guess it was, a while ago now, 2011, with Marshall Gans, who's a lead organizer for Obama's campaign. And this is based a lot on his scholarship and his thinking around this, and the ways that those organizers really connected with people and really, built, a structure to essentially elect the first Black president of the United States. So there's just so much power in what those organizers were able to do, and this is sharing a bit of that. So this quote, I use this in my TEDx talk, and I think it's something that can really ground our conversation today. The 2 most important days in your life are the day that you're born and the day you find out why. And I think communicating that in anything you're doing, in a sales pitch, in a speech that you're giving, even in a conversation on a first date, can really pull people towards you and help them understand who you are and why you do what you do. So first, what is Story of Self? It's basically just a story that shows why you do what you do and what makes you you. And then, like I said before, there are so many different uses, from public speaking to selling to just generally persuading people. The one thing I want to key in on here are choice points. So you really want to come up with a couple, maybe 2 to 3 choice points when your values became real. So this is a moment when you were faced with a challenge and you had to make a choice to go in one direction or the other. And it should reveal something about you and your values. It doesn't have to be like deep, dark, painful secrets per se, but they do have to be choices that are clear to the audience and demonstrate your values as well. I thought this quote from Marshall Gans was really good. We all have stories of pain, or we wouldn't think the world needs changing. We all have stories of hope, or we wouldn't think we could change it. Just to illustrate this sort of like our life is a mix of, balance. It's a balance of hope and pain, and we try to illustrate that in the stories that we tell. And then lastly, down there, I linked a really good resource about just walking you through the steps of building your story of self for your use later on. So just the basics, I'm a writer, I'm a storyteller. So, there are some pieces here about, just starting with like generally good storytelling. So who are you as a character? You're defined by your choices and those are in response to challenges that you've made. And then what are the outcomes of those choices? And then what's the sort of moral arc of your life? Just thinking about that as you're writing really any story. And then just wanted to show you the second graphic to the right here. So Story of Self isn't unto itself. It's a piece of a larger spectrum called public narrative. So your story of self is like why you've been called to leadership, why you've been called to do whatever you're doing. And then there are two other stories, which we'll talk about briefly, but your story of us. So what about you and your story connects you to others, right? And then also the story of now. So what are you actually asking people to do? Are you asking them to vote? Are you asking them to buy something, to protest, to do whatever? That's what you want to be thinking about. And there's a whole ecosystem here, and you want to connect all these pieces and be thoughtful about how you're connecting them. So in terms of our focus here, again, the story of self is constructed around choice points. So think of these as little mini stories that show others who you are. You need to make sure there's a balance of challenge and hope. I think the best example of this, go back and watch Obama's 2004 speech at the Democratic National Convention. I was on the floor for that speech, and I can tell you firsthand, like everyone in the room had goosebumps. Everyone in the room was fixated. We all know the story about the boy who was born in Hawaii and whose mom was from Kansas and father was from Kenya. One of the best examples, I think, in history of weaving your story of self into a story of us, which became a story about America, which got him elected and pushed people to, come out for hope and change and all that stuff. So I think, go back and review that. I think a really good way to get good at stories of self are to review good stories of self. And I think his is a good one to start with. Also thinking about your goal too. I think most times when we speak publicly, our goal is to be respected and trusted, because that's the basis for any kind of relationship, really, whether it's a transactional one or, a romantic one or anything. And notice I didn't say liked, because I think that's a different thing. It's maybe a higher bar. But I think you need to start with that baseline of being respected and trusted. As you're writing your story of self, think about this question of like, what connects you to the audience? So, don't just think about, this is all about me. I'm just going to tell my story. So for example, in my story of self, I talk a lot about, my relationship with my family, with my parents. And that's something that connects me with a lot of other people. And so, if you can bring out those threads of connectivity between your story and others, be thinking about that as you're choosing your choice points. The next one is, don't obsess about being accessible, because that's when you become inauthentic. There's a really good joke about Jennifer Lawrence that she's annoyingly relatable, right? It's like, it almost feels like she's trying to be relatable sometimes, but she's like this big famous movie star, makes millions of dollars. So for me, the way that plays out is like, I have a really, different story than most people. I was adopted. I, was raised by 2 dads, so I had gay parents. I've worked in education and criminal justice before, and there are a lot of things about my story that might not seem accessible, but when I weave them into my story, as you'll see if you watch my talk, people are able to connect with them on the basis of just family or the basis of challenges that they've had in their life or what have you. So I try to bring up the moral thread inside of stories that might seem less accessible. And then decide what you want out of your audience. So when I gave my talk, I was, asking people to take steps in the right direction towards criminal justice reform. And, one of the ways I did that is I talked about how, my mother, before I was born, she was actually pregnant with me while she was in prison, right? That's a huge, big revelation. So I just dropped that on you guys, and I dropped it on the audience. But then I connected it to, what I was asking of them. I said, look, this is something that's personally affected me. The war on drugs, the criminal industrial complex, prison industrial complex has gotten out of hand, and it's affected me, and so I told them a really personal story of self. And I said, here's what I want you to do about it. I want you to advocate for prison reform. I want you to advocate for changes in our legal system that are going to help little kids like the one I was caught up in that system to have a better life. And that was, so as I was creating my story of self, I connected it to what I wanted to ask of the audience, that story of now. So do's and don'ts. You definitely, as I mentioned, you want to connect it to your story of us and your story of now. So be thinking as you're creating your story of self, how am I gonna connect this to the broader audience, whoever your audience is, and how am I going to connect it to what I'm asking of those people? And that doesn't mean necessarily changing your story of self. It just means like highlighting different parts of it, or emphasizing different parts of it, or even omitting different parts of it. Sometimes omitting things is actually more effective than adding things. Definitely make it relevant to the task at hand, as I just mentioned. So I told a particular part of my story about my mother and her experience that was most salient to what I was asking of people. Be vulnerable again. People actually eat it up, so don't be afraid of that. You really empower other people to be vulnerable, whether it's in the moment with you or later on when you are vulnerable. And I think that's really important. And then think about your mini stories. Give people little bite-sized pieces that paint a memorable picture, right? So for me, I tell a story about, like having two dads and being adopted and meeting my mom for the first time. And then I move on to a point where, I'm older and I'm graduating from university and I get this, harrowing phone call. And then I move on to a point in my story where I actually get fired from my job for a specific reason that relates to criminal justice reform. And those are all moments that people latched onto in my talk, and I constructed them very intentionally. In terms of don't just dwell on yourself. I know that sounds weird. You're not that important. So what I mean by that is just to, tell your story, but be constantly connecting it to, a broader story about humanity or, the task that you're asking people to engage in. That's really important. And don't just tell your story, you want to show it. So again, make those choice points like little tiny, very descriptive, very vivid moments that people can latch onto that tell a larger story. Don't always paint yourself as the hero. So this is one of the hardest things that I had to do, right? So I had to reveal to an audience that my father was in for the first time publicly that I had a record, right? I have a criminal record, and it's something that is like a very painful thing for me. But it's something that was important to the story that I was telling. And certainly when you reveal it about yourself, regardless of the veracity of whatever's going on there, you are certainly not the hero of that story, and you're certainly being vulnerable. And it's something that, and then you realize you connected. So there are 65 million Americans actually who have a criminal record, right? That's a huge chunk of the country, but that's something that is connects you with a larger narrative. Like there's this problem in the United States going on of over-criminalization and over-incarceration. So don't always paint yourself as the hero, and also connect it. Don't humble brag. It's the worst, right? So just don't drop in little things like, oh, when I was meeting with like this, senator or something like that, blah, blah, blah. Just be careful about that, because people pick up on it and it can disconnect you from the audience. And then again, with the details, be careful about the details that you're sharing. Don't always think you need to tell every little piece. Really focus on the pieces of the choice point that are most relevant, and then build out from that if you need to create a scene around that. So like a true teacher, I'm going to give you some homework. I want you to go home from this talk and or go wherever you need to go and construct 3 choice points that illustrate your story of self. So they can be in chronological order, or just 3 moments that you think really define your life. Take about 5-10 minutes to write them out. I would encourage you to sort of free write and just really clear out 10 or 15 minutes to just write them out, and just allow yourself to like write down whatever comes up first, because that's usually some of the best stuff. feel free to take a look at the talk that I gave, and I welcome feedback on that, and hopefully it's helpful to you as well. And I also want you to share your story with someone else in your cohort. So practice it. You know, the best way, we did a ton of practice with Marshall Gans when he trained us on this, and you just practice it over and over and over again. And that's, like most things, how you get good. Questions? This is how you reach me. And thanks for listening. Super excited to hear your questions.
Thanks, Paul. For all of you on who have any questions, feel free to type them in. Also, FYI, I will be we are recording this, and we'll also put up the slides as well, so you'll have access to them forever. No questions at all, huh? Because they're a quiet bunch.
It's early or late.
Cool. Well, no, never mind. Just as I was ready to end it up. We've got a couple of questions here.
So should I go with that first one then? What's the importance of telling your story? Why should anyone care about it? Why should you care about your own story? That's a great one. So I think a quick answer is that it really depends on the task and the goal, right? So if you're trying to persuade people to donate to a nonprofit, that was my job. If you're trying to get someone to sell something, I think a lot of times people are invested in the person, you know, the person who's standing in front of them at their door, trying to get them to vote for a candidate, or who's, you know, speaking at a trade show, trying to get them to buy a product and things like that. So I think a lot of times, you know, I feel this when people walk into rooms and present for the first time, they don't introduce themselves. They don't, you know, say where they're from or who they are. And for me, at least, I'm sort of like, look, I don't know who you are from, you know, Adam or Jane, you know, and I'm having a hard time connecting with you. And so I think starting off with like, look, this is why I'm even in the room. This is why you should care about whatever I'm trying to do is important. And then why you should care about your own story. Yeah, I mean, that is a very existential question. I think it's your story. I mean, it's how you present yourself to the world. I think it's the difference between reputation and character, and character being like who you really are, and reputation being who people think you are. And I think you need to be the author of your own best story, and to do that in a really authentic way that shows all your victories and all your warts, all your challenges. So yeah, I think it's important. Molly gave us a shout. Thanks, Molly. You're the best. Jessica, do you have any tips for balancing being vulnerable and also not focusing or dwelling too much on yourself? Yeah. Oh, that's a good one. I would say like, there's one thing that Dave and I actually talked about. Like, you know, I revealed some like significant heavy stuff about myself, like in this talk right here, right? So I'm trying to model that, but also you need to be constantly almost like a thermostat, like as a speaker, measuring how much you turn up the heat or how much you don't, I guess. And so I would say like, you know, if you're thinking about like 2 to 3 choice points, like maybe 1 or 2 of them max being something that's like significantly vulnerable to you that you can roll out in a way that's significant. But then always think about how that thing connects you to other people. So if it's a story about like loss in your family, for example, you know, like share that for a moment and then move on to, okay, well, this is something that a lot of people experience. And I think the best way to not dwell on yourself is just connect whatever you've experienced to what other people experience. But yeah, I mean, it is about you. So I don't think you should be afraid to be vulnerable. Yeah.
We actually have a question in the chat. If you want to take a look at them there.
Oh, sure. How do I get to that? I'm struggling here.
Actually, I can just read it to you.
Yeah.
Easy. You elaborate on how we can engage in the vulnerable without confusing the story.
Yeah, I do see it now. Um, yeah, I mean, I would say everyone's really keying in on the vulnerability piece here, which is good, and it's probably one of the most important pieces, I think. I think it's really about how you like construct your story from the get-go, right? So, you know, think about like, I think sometimes people stand up there and they're like, I'm just going to tell this like really heart-wrenching story of like loss and pain, and like, and in so doing, people are going to be connected to me, and they're just going to really feel, you know, so sad for me and pity me. You don't want to go that route, obviously. So I would say, you know, think about the vulnerability that matters, right? Like think about what your call to action is for people in any given talk, and then think about the nugget of vulnerability that most makes sense for that talk. So, you know, in my example, for me, obviously it was what my mother went through before I was born, and I directly connected that to what I was asking of people, you know, related to the nonprofit I was working for. I think, yeah, and it is easy to get lost in your own vulnerability and just like dive too deeply in that. So measure that out with friends, you know, measure that out with people who know you, and say, you know, is this resonating? Am I hitting on the right points of this story? Sometimes I've even had friends who told me, you know, don't tell that side of the story, tell this side of the story. Sometimes other people from the outside can sort of, you know, hear different things and know you a little better than you know yourself in some ways. So, yeah, I hope that's some measure of a good answer for your question, but.
Cool. Well, if we don't have anything else, then thank you guys so much for showing up. Just a little sneak preview for next 2 weeks and 2 weeks. We will have Encore from Ikigai talking about productivity and how you can get the most out of it. So should be a really interesting one. Keep in mind we will be doing this every 2 weeks when there's no town hall. So whenever you don't have a town hall on a Wednesday, you can expect one of these guys. So keep an eye out in all the ways we communicate with you. And I'm super excited to keep this going. And if you definitely want to get in touch with me, with Paul, feel free to hit us up on Slack. If you have any questions, want to present as well, let me know. Thank
Cool.
you all
Thanks,
so much.
Bye.
Bye.